Welcome back to another edition of the Friday 5 Download, where I do a recap of 5 podcasts I listen to throughout the week and some of the ones that you guys suggested. I'm looking to incite discussion and hopefully give you a mostly objective, but also impart some of my own reactions and my own takeaways from each of these podcasts. The first podcast is the Flying Coach Podcast with Pete Carroll and Steve Kerr. Two outstanding coaches who I have a ton of respect for, both championship coaches and both coaches who I think are pretty progressive in the way that they lead. I've always just been admired their creativity and the things that they do and the people that they bring in to help build the programs and the culture that they want to build. Pete is the head coach of the Seattle Seahawks. Steve Kerr is the head coach of the Golden State Warriors. This episode was released on April 28th, and they actually had a guest, Brene Brown, who is self-help, personal development, and leadership guru. And she's also a sports fan, which I didn't know, and we'll talk about that in just a second. They talked about preparing for a championship loss, and they both had tough championship losses. Pete Carroll in 2015, he was going for a repeat, and they lost the Super Bowl with the ball on the 1-yard line. Russell Wilson threw an interception. Pete Carroll actually ended up taking the blame for that because he didn't call a run play instead of a pass play when he had one of the best running backs in the league. And so preparing for that loss, and then in Golden State in 2015-2016, they set a record for wins in a season, 73 wins, beating the Bulls that we're hearing so much about right now in The Last Dance. And they lost in Game 7 to LeBron and the Cavs. And so preparing for what do you do and how do you talk to your team after a loss, especially a championship loss. I personally related to this because I took over 2 lacrosse programs in the last 5 years that were really in a bad place. And it was inevitable that we were going to lose. And I really struggled on how to be authentic during those times. It's nice to hear that 2 of the best coaches that are out there right now discuss this and come clean with the fact that it's not easy to talk to your team after a loss. Do you feel it out? Do you just kind of not have a plan and just go with whatever and just try to be as authentic as you can in the moment? Or do you have a script? I felt like I had to have a script in some tough losses. I know, like when I was at Prairie View High School in Brighton, it was going to be tough for us to win some of the games. It was inevitable we were going to lose and probably going to lose by a lot. And I found it was better to have kind of a canned message rather than giving into my emotions, because there was games that it felt like I got bullied for 2 hours and the kids did too. And, I couldn't give in to those emotions. And I felt like just, taking away the life lessons was the most important thing. They introduced Brene Brown into the episode, and I was really pleased by this. I didn't know she was such a sports nut, and that was really cool. She had one quote that hit me really, really hard. She talks with and works with professional teams, and she talks with coaches all the time. And she says, coaches are driven by fire, and that fire can either keep you alive or it can burn you down. I personally, after grinding for 3 years to get to a point where I could coach lacrosse full time for a living, the fire burned me down. I burned out. And that's why I've been leaning into other things like yoga and meditation and doing these types of things, because I needed a different outlet besides lacrosse. I needed a yin to my yang. So I really related to that. And, she also talked about, and they spent a good amount of time talking about modeling vulnerability as a coach and creating an environment where it is valued and supported so that your players are more apt to, express their vulnerability. And by expressing vulnerability, the collective team can grow better together rather than stuffing down feelings and just not admitting to, maybe when you're not as confident or whatever. It's been a process for me to step into this type of coaching over the last 5 years and create this culture. But I truly believe this is the way we get the most out of our team. I highly suggest this for anyone in a leadership role, especially if you're a sports person or a Brene Brown fan. If you have any leadership role whatsoever, I highly suggest listening to this podcast. It was worth it. The next podcast we're going to talk about is the Kingsbury podcast, episode number 153. It was released on April 28th, and it's about an hour and 6 minutes long. The CEO of Sigmatic, which is a mushroom tea and elixir company. His name is Tero Isokauppila, I believe. And he's from Finland, and he grew up and in Finland became aware of the healing powers of mushrooms. I've been interested in learning more about Sigmatic and mushrooms for a while. The reason is I've been hearing more and more of my podcast digital mentors talking about it. And that's kind of how I vet whatever the next trend is in health and fitness and wellness, is who is talking about it, how often are they talking about it, and are they like living the results? You know, sometimes it's kind of hard to tell. Are they getting paid? Are they sponsored by them? But I've heard more and more about Sigmatic, so I was really excited to listen to this podcast. I personally was hoping it would be a little bit more for beginners, and I was looking for a description of the benefits of their over-the-counter products from Sigmatic, but they didn't talk about them that much. They did go into psychedelic and the magic mushrooms, which was cool and interesting to talk about. I'm an advocate for psychedelics. I'm an advocate for plant medicines. I've done ayahuasca and psilocybin, but both with intention. The key is intention. These aren't party drugs. It's not something you do because your friend is going to do it. You need to have an intention of what you want to try to get out of the experience, and you should have a guide. At the end of the podcast, I thought the most interesting part was they talked about the origins of the Santa Claus story and how it came from mushroom ceremonies. They did two big ceremonies a year, winter solstice and summer solstice, and the winter was more famous. The objective was to talk to the dead and ask them for wisdom for the new year. Santa was a shaman, and he would collect psychedelic mushrooms, the Amanita muscaria mushroom, which is a pretty famous mushroom. It's the red and white one that you see. It's the red and white mushroom emoji. It's the mushroom that Super Mario eats. And it's in all the Disney movies. Well, anyway, the shaman would collect the mushrooms in summer, which they grew under spruce trees, and then they would hang them on the branches until the winter, until they dried. So the analogy, just to connect it there, is that the presents would be under the tree, the mushrooms. They put the bulbs on the tree, the bulbs would be the mushrooms hanging on the branches. And, in order to dry them out, they also would put them on top of the fire if it took longer, and that would be where, you would have them in stockings. So that's kind of, and it goes even deeper. I had never heard of this. So I was really kind of shocked, but it makes a lot of sense. Like, where did Santa come from? Like, understood the Christian basis of the Christmas holiday, but how does Santa play in all that? I never even considered it, or never really, maybe, I guess, retained anything that I did learn over that. So it was really cool to get exposed to that. I did a little bit of Googling, and there's a YouTube video that I'll give you a link to that explains it. Really condensed version. Also, Tero, the guest on the show, wrote a book called Santa Sold Shrooms. And I didn't read it, but apparently it's all very well explained in that book. The third podcast we're going to talk about is the Jocko Podcast, episode number 227. It was released on April 29th. It's 2 hours and 21 minutes. I'm going to out myself right now. I did not listen to the whole thing. I only listened to about an hour. It's about learning for ultimate winning. It's the guest is David Berke. The basis of the show is they're reviewing this new Marine Corps doctrinal publication, an MCDP. And, if you don't know much about Jocko, he's a former Navy SEAL. He has literally become his own brand. He does Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He's a black belt. He gets up at 4:30 in the morning. He wrote a book called Extreme Ownership, which I listened to and I absolutely love. And it's a great book to read. Another thing that I love about Jocko is he's got this motivational video on YouTube called Good, that, if you're struggling with anything, you let it rip and listen to that. I send it to my athletes if they've had a bad game, or if I know they're struggling through something. It's a really good little motivational. I'll have a link for you in the description for that video. It's really great. So Jocko is great when I need to push through some limits. He helps me, and I love it. However, he is definitely focused more on the doing rather than the being, and to force through and just struggle through. And I don't know that he like really honors feelings. And so for me, that's a little tough because I have to guard myself against overdoing things and working too hard and not slowing down. So for me, I have to limit how much Jocko exposure I get. Otherwise, I turn into wanting to be, a Navy SEAL. And that's not the life I'm trying to lead. So the bulk of the episode is him reading this Marine Corps doctrinal publication, this MCDP. And it's on learning. And, here's the deal. It's just my opinion, but when he reads this type of stuff word for word, I get a little lost, and I prefer just a summary. Like, it's just a little bit like he goes into this mode of, he almost sounds like a WWE character, and I have a hard time taking him seriously. And he's literally reading every word, and sort of just like saying comma, next, space, period. He really, he just loses me. And however, I love the topic. As a teacher and a coach, the topic of learning is obviously of utmost importance to me. But like one of the things that they were talking about is that they had to document that they needed to talk about why they were teaching Marines things and give the Marines the why behind things. And that mental fitness was just as important as physical fitness. And I found that to be like a lot of common sense, and maybe it's just because I've been around coaching and teaching for most of my adult life. So I found that to be, just again, common sense. But I also just found it hard to follow because he was reading straight from this publication. But however, if he was really excited about it. And if you're a vet, and especially a Marine, apparently this is the first MCDP that has dropped since 2001. So he was really excited. So if you're a Marine, I think it's definitely something that you might want to check out. Or if you're a vet and you're just into military stuff, I would definitely check it out. Because it seems like they're making positive changes in terms of how they treat the Marines and how they teach the Marines. The fourth podcast we're going to talk about is the Rich Roll podcast. It was released on May 7th, and it was with Dr. David Katz. The title of it was The Choreography of the Contagion Interdiction, or like basically how are we going to address this pandemic. Dr. David Katz has all the credentials you could ever imagine, and he currently focuses on functional lifestyle medicine and almost more like preventative public health. He wrote an op-ed, and it got published in the New York Times. The title is Our Fight Against the Coronavirus Worse Than the Disease? And essentially what he's saying is flattening the curve is not a long-term solution. We can't be on either extreme. We need a happy medium, which is what he's calling vertical interdiction. However, in our current political environment and how polarized our country is, this has been met with some controversy. People on the left don't like it. People on the right don't like it because it's in the middle. Essentially, this is what Sweden has done. And what he's talking about is total harm minimization. Minimize the harm of the infection, how it impacts the humans, right? How widespread it is, how severe it is, case by case. Minimize the impact of the infection. But also minimize the harm and the impact of the interdiction, of the measures that we take. So if it's shutting down our economy and we're losing money and people are losing jobs, obviously that's not good. If people are suffering from mental health issues because of it, that's not good. So what he's saying is we have to protect the people, and in order to protect the people, we need data. So what he's saying is we need a representative random sample of data that shows a cross-section from the United States, gender, socioeconomic demographics, age, etc., so that we can make an informed decision. And unlike Sweden, who basically just guessed at this approach, this what he's calling a vertical approach, where you have some different risk categories and you take different measures based on those risk categories. He's saying we can have our Swedish cake and eat it too. So we can do what they've done, but we can do it in a more informed way with data. So we would define the groups, the risk groups, high, low, medium, and maybe more. And each of those risk groups would have different protocols or measures that they need to take to reintegrate themselves back into society. If you're super high risk, you're probably still quarantined. If you're very low risk, you're probably back out doing your job, backing out in society, but also taking protective measures. Another interesting thing that he talked about was he's working on a personal risk calculator with his colleagues, which produces like a risk age. And prior to him going back to work in a hospital as a volunteer, he used the risk calculator. And although he's 57 years old, his risk age was 40. So it'll be interesting to see if this is something that will be a product, an actual useful tool that's going to come out hopefully sooner rather than later. The fifth podcast that we're going to talk about this week is Pivot. And it's the hosts are Kerr and Scott Galloway, and I don't have their credentials, but let me tell you, they're both very impressive on the air, and I really enjoyed listening to them. One of the first things that they talked about is what industries and companies will take a cyclical versus structural hit from this pandemic. So a structural hit would be it's done. It's been taken out at the foundation. This is no longer either going to be an industry or a thing. So an example of that they gave was movie theaters. Probably not going to see movie theaters going forward. I don't know how much of a leap that is. To me, it makes a lot of sense. I think attendance at movie theaters has been going down for a while, and that industry has changed quite a bit over the years. So the fact that it could be done forever because of this doesn't surprise me. An example of a cyclical would be Disney. Scott Galloway has kids, and he specifically mentioned Disney and saying that his kids still want to go to Disney. They don't care about the pandemic. So they're gonna have to find a way to make Disney still available to people. And I mostly agree with that. Another cyclical one would be parks. Another one that they mentioned was cruises. So apparently Carnival Cruises opened their books in August, and they're already like booked full. I don't know if that'll actually end up happening, but I don't think that that's going to be a long-term hit. One other structural hit or structural casualty of this pandemic they mentioned was gyms. So box gyms, places where you go work out, franchise type gyms. I would say even probably CrossFit type gyms, although they tend to work out in smaller groups. So I think they might be okay. But I can see that, the 24-hour fitness, tons and tons of people, Planet Fitness, those types of things where there's just like so many people touching so many things. I could see that one taking a hit. Another topic I really enjoyed listening to was Uber is making some moves to make an investment in Lime scooters. And they made the investment at an 80% discount of the perceived value of Lime. And they talked about the fact that Lime may have been overvalued or whatever. But I just found this really interesting. They pointed out the fact that people with cash can make smart investments right now and make a huge impact. And maybe some risk, but it's definitely something to think about. Another thing that they talked about is that Uber could be the one-stop shop app for everything travel, or one of those. And that may be the way we do things from now on. And that like even subways and public transportation will then be privatized through a company like Uber. And from the minute you leave your door to leave for your vacation till the time you get into your hotel room, including the booking of that hotel room, could be all done within one app. And I think that's really smart. And I hope that comes out of this. And a major topic they talked about on this podcast was the new Facebook oversight board or committee and whether it will be effective in controlling content on the platform. Kara, one of the hosts, she wrote an article again in the New York Times, and I'll have a link for you on that. And she compared it to the coronavirus, Facebook to the coronavirus, and basically said, it is what it is. It's designed to grow and sprawl and just conquer and do its thing. And it's going to be hard to reel it in. But anyway, they talked a little bit about the structure of the board, and they compared it to like United Nations. And Scott said maybe League of Nations, which apparently was a slight, but I don't know the difference between those two. So that's my ignorance. But one of the takeaways from that part of the discussion was, if you want a board to get something done, keep it small. If you don't want the board to get something done, keep it big. So they were basically theorizing that Facebook and basically Mark Zuckerberg was purposefully growing this board with too many people so that things really don't ever get done, because they make money based on the way Facebook is designed, which is to do the things that Facebook does. And that goes to my last point. I don't know what the purpose of this oversight board is. And I don't think they really talked about that. So is it to control artificial intelligence, monitoring, censorship? I'm not sure, but I felt like they could have been a little bit more clear on that. And at the end, we get a little bit of comic relief with guest Sarah Cooper, who is a writer and comedian, and she's been doing lip syncing of Trump's press conferences on TikTok, and apparently they've been going viral. And I guess she even got like a little bit of a shout out from Jerry Seinfeld recently. So she's just really kind of blown up from it in the last few weeks. And so I'm going to put some links to some TikToks out there for you if you want to check those out. And that's it for this week's shows. Please leave a comment if you have any suggestions or if you have any thoughts on the shows we covered. Again, I'd like this to be a discussion. Tell me what you think. And until next time, this has been another Friday 5 download. We'll see you next week.